Welcome to From Here to Eternity, a Gateway Seminary podcast about the nations. My name is Phil Hopkins. I'm the host. I'm a professor of missions at Gateway Seminary. I've been here for a few years until recently, for about 20 years or so, I lived overseas. In this podcast, we address topics related to the cross-cultural spread of the gospel from here in California, across the U.S., and throughout the world. In these podcasts, these next couple podcasts are from the Evangelical Missiological Society. We had a meeting at Gateway Seminary on April 4th of 2025, the Southwest Regional Meeting, where we talked about topics related to ecclesiology and mission. And there were a number of people who presented, and in their presentations, we were able to record some of those. So we have a few of those here that have been recorded. Most of them are of pretty good quality. There are some that maybe are not so much, but we want to include those in this podcast segment. So there'll be a number of them that'll be spread out, talking from people from various backgrounds throughout the West Coast. Largely throughout the West Coast, from people from Fuller Seminary, from Cal Baptist, from Biola, from other different types of ministry organizations that are talking about ecclesiology and mission. So please enjoy. You'll see a number of different presentations that vary in length and that are quite unique to the people who, just as unique as the people who are presenting them. So we're thankful for those people. We're thankful that they have given us permission to record them, and we hope you all enjoy these podcasts, these presentations of these people. So enjoy, and please contact me with any questions if you have any. Thank you.
Thank you guys for coming to our talk. I'm excited to have you here. So I'm Will Ingersoll. I have a PhD in economics from the University of Arizona. I teach over at APU, Azusa Pacific University, just down the road here. And this is my co-author and co-presenter, Dave, if you would.
And so, Dave Dunaetz, and former church planter in France, and a long-term EMS member here, and teach organizational psychology at Azusa Pacific.
And so I've had the pleasure of Dave taking me on with some of his work. So he's been doing a series of different surveys looking at church challenges, pastoral and church leader challenges that people have faced, and just trying to get a feel for where those things are. And so this work comes out of those surveys that we've been looking at. And so today we wanted to talk a little bit about some of our preliminary findings for generational differences in mental health and ministry challenges between boomers and Gen Z missionaries, and how they might complement each other and need each other in different ways. Okay. So one of the assumptions, if we're trying to apply this to missionaries in particular, the study was focused on church leaders. And so there's not necessarily a one-to-one mapping between missionaries and church leaders and pastors directly. So put that caveat in your mind when you're looking at these results. But we still think there's a strong enough connection for this to be interesting. Another note, generally when we're thinking of older, or when we say boomers, we're kind of grouping the older spectrum of the mature generations, right? So, which is Gen Xers and baby boomers versus millennials and Gen Zers as on the younger side. Going back one slide, something I should mention, and Dave did mention, we have this QR code if you want to download this guy yourself. So Dave knows how to do that. I don't know how to do that. So that's something where perhaps we need each other. And then this guy here looks a little funny. You'll see the text isn't quite right. You might guess that it's basically just AI generated image with some prompting and trying to get it towards in the style of a comic book output. So we found that brightened up the presentation a little bit. I think we just did it using Microsoft's little AI that comes with PowerPoint. So you can do some fun stuff with that rather than just going to clip art. So you'll see that throughout some of the prompts based on what we saw. So, yeah. We're looking generally at church challenges that people face, but we also collected data on people's ages, among other potential demographic info. And so mostly we're looking at those church challenges and then trying to see, hey, is there a difference when we separate by age, right? And see, are older people facing different challenges or sets of challenges than younger people? So how is this conducted? As I mentioned, there's a kind of a yearly series of studies that have been going on that Dave has been spearheading for the Great Commission Research Network. The 2024 one focused on challenges by pastors, and that's what we're basing this off of. Who's in that? What are some of the summary statistics? So average age was about 54, 96% is male. Race and ethnicity, it's vast majority white, 7.2 mixed race, 4.3% Hispanic, Black, and Asian, you see at 3.5 and 2.3. This is coming from, missed a slide of where, yes, I did jump over this one. So this might help explain some of those demographics as well, right? So we have 347 people who self-identified in the survey as pastors. We focused on a couple of particular of these denominations or groups. Part of this was sponsored by them to get some information on their particular groups, but it was also open to some other people. It ends up being a convenient sample, seeing who would respond to these things. And so those groups tend to be more white, male, and they tend towards more conservative side of what you consider the denominations. So what did we actually ask them about? Okay, so there was a list of 79 challenges that were put together by those groups as challenges of potential interest. So some of the examples would be, how much of a challenge is it, or do you have, or how do you view, how much do you view this as a challenge? So retaining young adults in the church, how difficult is it to recruit lay leaders from your congregation? How is dealing with depression, is that a challenge for you or not? Okay. So that's what we saw, and we had them rated on a scale of 1 to 5, so 1 being not a challenge, 5 being an insurmountable challenge, and 3 being a significant challenge. Take the average of everything, right? We get about average of 2.5. So right, in between a slight and a significant challenge. So these were things that people generally saw as at least something on their radar.
Can I ask a question about mental health?
Mm-hmm.
Was the focus just on depression, or were there other aspects of mental health that were?
There were 79 items, and about 8 of them had to do with mental health.
Okay.
Yeah. I think there's going to be another slide.
Yeah, I think mental health was one of the big clusters of, so, we have all these different ones, but we do cluster them as we look at when they were related. So I don't take your thunder, Dave. But
We will have a 10-minute question and answer period.
Okay, sorry to
after
interrupt.
we're
I just
It's
wanted
okay.
to know if it was a broader mental health thing.
yeah, so there's more than just that, yes. Good question. And I think we can make the list of challenges available to you if you'd like to see that as well. Another demographic piece or information piece that we captured was the size of the church. And as you can see, right, most churches are between 51 to 100 or less, right? So the median was a 3, right? 3 corresponds to that 51 to 100. Right? So the majority of churches are on that relatively smaller side. That's also the mode, it's when we see the most. If we include a little bit more than that, a little over 100, okay, we have another big chunk of the distribution, right? And it's much more rare to be a lot bigger. So you certainly shouldn't feel discouraged if you're in this range. This is what a lot of people are experiencing. This is just what churches look like, at least among those people surveyed. The average response, because it goes all the way to 9, that kind of tends to push the average up. So median is probably a better measure. Average is 3.43, so somewhere a little above that. But still an interesting piece of info on the distribution of church sizes, at least we thought. One other thing we looked at, we also asked about measures of church growth. Just asking how fast do you think your church is growing, or really it's a Likert scale. So where we've got my church is growing numerically, and you either agree or disagree on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being strongly disagree, 3 being in the middle, and 5 strongly agree. As you might expect, churches that are growing tend to be bigger. So there's a correlation between church size and growth. Just a regular correlation coefficient of 0.44, so they tend to move upwards together. And then there was also a negative correlation with age and church growth, which means that as your pastor is younger, then you're growing more. So as your pastor is older, then you tend to be growing less quickly. And so that's the setup of some of the summary statistics here. And I'm going to pass it off to Dave to talk about some of the results we found between the actual challenges.
All right. Okay, so we looked at these 79 challenges. We just kind of like created this big list of what are the challenges facing churches, kind of dumped them on people and asked all these pastors, how much of a challenge is this? And we got lots of numbers doing that. And so what we have to do is, because humans aren't good at like these big piles of numbers and lists of 79 averages and means and medians and stuff, we did what's known as a factor analysis, where we looked at which of the challenges naturally clump together, which ones naturally go. And the 4 most challenging factors were evangelism. Everything having to do with evangelism, that's what churches find to be the most difficult right now. Children's and youth programs were also difficult, especially the youth programs. Everything having to do with leader emergence, raising up leaders, leadership selection, finding the right interns, pastoral candidates, that was real high in the challenges. And then dealing with the effects of social media was also a major challenge that was different than all the other challenges that they faced. The least challenging things, the things that pastors think that they can do the best, are they can deal with hostility that's directed towards the church. That was the least challenging. In general, pastors are fairly stable mentally. The mental well-being for most pastors was not an issue. Dealing with political issues in the church was not very difficult. And also, dealing with church conflicts in the majority of churches was not a thing now. Of course, some churches would be suffering immensely from that, but on the average, those were the least challenging. So what we wanted to do was saying, okay, are there generational differences in these challenges? So the question is, some challenges might be more difficult for boomers and Xers than for millennials and Gen Z. And I think that this difference in American churches would play out among North American missionaries, because they are all subject to the same cultural forces, especially growing up and defining their generational identity. So these would have a positive correlation, and some challenges might be more difficult for millennials and Gen Z than for boomers and Xers. So the Gen Z might be really good in, and the older missionaries and pastors might be better in. That'd be a negative correlation. And it turned out that there were 3 in each category. So the question, where do Gen Z and millennials struggle, and boomer and Xers excel? The number one was in mental well-being. The older pastors, older missionaries are a lot more emotionally stable than the younger pastors. These were the 7 items that grouped together, dealing with depression, avoiding falling into depression, maintaining mental health, resolving personal frustrations. That's a real struggle for the younger generations compared to the older generations. A second one where Gen Z and millennials struggled was in self-management. Managing my time, maintaining a personal time of Bible study, meeting my job responsibilities, accomplishing all of my responsibilities. Everything had to do with time management and choosing how they use their time. And it included staying connected with God, which is like pretty important for a pastor and missionary, was a greater struggle for millennial than for Gen X, than for the older. And then a third way, which was interesting, is that the younger pastors struggled more with finances than the older ones. The older ones were able to better assure their church's financial stability and help the church meet their budget. The older ones were better than that. So those are the three that the older pastors were better at, but there were three that the younger pastors were better at. One was evangelism. Us old people are kind of clueless on how to do evangelism nowadays, but for the Gen Z and millennials, it's not as difficult. They said it was less of a challenge for them. So that included both evangelizing people, touching the community, mobilizing for evangelism, and retaining young adults. That was the main thing where Gen Zs and millennials excelled. A second area is in leading effective programs for adults. Gen Zs and millennials have more of this intuitive sense of what's going to work in our contemporary culture for having an effective program, creating high quality worship services, retaining members, creating attractive programs, than do us older folk. And then the third one where Gen Z and millennials excelled was in dealing with the effects of social media, helping people not get so messed up by social media, because that is one of the major factors that's influencing people in a lot of negative ways. So we've got these three areas where older missionaries struggle with evangelism, effective programs, and helping people with the negative effects of social media. Younger missionaries struggle with mental health, self-management, and church finances. Plus, we have this idea that churches with younger leaders are growing faster than churches with older leaders. Okay, so that's the basic results. And now I'm going to pass back to Will, who's going to present an application.
Yeah. So there might be a number of ways you might think of trying to apply the results here. Seeing that there are different challenges, or at least challenges that are more strongly felt by older versus younger and younger versus older. And so we think that there's a pretty straightforward application that we could think of, and perhaps we could think of more ourselves, but simply making sure that we're pairing up older missionaries with younger missionaries. Right? So there are young missionaries who have and can draw on older missionaries for strength and emotional stability, help with those types of challenges, for helping to deal with things like finances. So the older missionaries can help with those challenges for the younger missionaries, help them, guide them through those things they find more difficult. And the younger missionary, right, paired up with the older one, can be a driver of evangelism, of leading programs, of connecting with younger people and dealing with those things that are more directly culturally relevant when they have a lifetime, more or less. The Gen Zers grew up with social media pretty much ubiquitous. They kind of understand the intricacies of that and can help with dealing with those types of problems, as well as just running social media to find people where they are out there on different platforms and places. I'm an older millennial, so Facebook was new when I was in college, but I don't even have an Instagram, right? So I could use some help from some of the Gen Zers, I think, for a lot of that stuff. And so, yeah, kind of putting those teams together, I mean, either in pairs or through some kind of organization providing that kind of support, we think might be a way of increasing the effectiveness of both of them and covering each other's weaknesses in different ways. So that's, we're a little on the quick side, but no one minds more time, so that's what we have. So any questions for us?
Yes. So do you think some of this is due to generational profiles, or is it just maturity?
I mean, it could be that some of these things are just universally true, right? It's not surprising to think that people who are older have more life experience, they've been through more things, and are more emotionally stable. So I certainly don't think we're like necessarily uncovering something that's completely novel in that sense. But it's good to see that our intuition that we would think is true plays out in the data, and that's something that we see here. I think some of the novelty might come from the direct application to the cultural changes, like things like social media. I think it helps to center us on what it is that they really can help with compared to little folks. Do you have thoughts on that?
Definitely the mental health thing. The decline in mental health of young people. We've never experienced anything like this in the 100 years that we've been tracking mental health and stuff. So that's definitely a generational difference. Especially Generation Z is so unstable compared to previous generations. That's not just a developmental issue. It's definitely a generational thing. The rate at change which culture is changing is probably a factor in the fact that the older missionaries no longer think that, and pastors no longer feel confident in being able to create the programs that are going to be culturally relevant. So I think that's part developmental, part generational, because things are changing faster than ever. So, but some of it could be developmental too. Maybe the experience with finances, that might be just due to.
Yeah, I was thinking of the time management compared to,
Yeah, I'm not sure about the time management, because the Generation Z and Generation X has grown up with this almost being controlled by social media and what's on the screen and stuff, and that influences their use of time so much. So it's hard to say that one. I was talking to my wife yesterday, and we were saying we're probably the last generation that will not have some type of a brain implant. Will be, and you can see how the movement is towards social media controlling our time, and that's the whole thing with the algorithms, is that these commercial forces are trying to vie for our attention and guide how we spend our time, and so that we can obtain our resources. So,
Right.
getting back, yeah.
I have a question regarding that. Did you guys witness or come across collaboration between the two generations? Is there a willingness to actually collaborate? Because we all know in your pastor, you were one of them, you began to be very territorial and resistant to that kind of thing. Did you see an openness?
In the paper for pastors, we addressed that because older pastors are just really scared of losing their job, no longer having a position in front of people. Because we're suggesting that older missionaries and older pastors, which might be easier for older missionaries, to take more of a behind-the-scenes role and a support role, and have the younger generation be more up in front because they're so much more effective at evangelism and programs. But yeah, there's definitely some resistance, and the solution to that is humility. Being able to give up one's upfront role, give up one's power, being there to serve the church as a whole, the mission as a whole, the community as a whole in a church planting context. But yeah, there's going to be a resistance, and that's a real issue. But the best solution is humility. And fortunately, in missionary contexts, missionary support tends not to be based on whether they're up in front or not, so that wouldn't be as a major effect as it could be for older missionaries. A secondary implication of that is that if younger and older are working together, there's got to be a really effective division of labor so that they really are complementary to each other and not competing against one another. So this is just a general trend that's supported by the data, the differences in the generations, and how they play out. There's not a cookie cutter solution, but it needs to be worked out very specifically in each specific context. Is that what your observation is too, or?
Yes. Yes.
Can you go back to the method of data collection?
Let's see. This one or
No,
So you guys, sorry, I was trying to help someone who's hopefully giving a talk later as well. But the way you guys ask the questions, you qualitative, you ask people to self-report.
Well, no, we asked, they self-reported that they were pastors. That was the participation criteria, was that they'd be pastors. And we asked them, gave them a list of 79 struggles. How much of a struggle is the following for each of you? It was on a 1 to 5 scale.
Okay, yeah, I'm just really curious because typically from the older generation, there's a tendency to underreport what's going on in one's mental health, and even having the words to say I'm depressed for the older generation is a lot more difficult than it is for like Gen Z or millennials. We're like, yeah, everybody's depressed. I can talk about it. Nobody's gonna, fire me because I said I'm depressed. So I kind of wonder how much the idea of self-reporting or the process of self-reporting and having someone say like, oh, I'm not depressed, even though you might be like, oh no, actually you exhibit a lot of the factors of being depressed, like takes part in a lot of like this.
So by changing the nature of the questions, you might get more honest answers, like how often did you imagine this, or how often did you imagine that, or those types of things.
Yeah, I mean, therapeutic, like the way that a therapist will ask the questions, like, are you depressed is one thing, but like, how many times in the last 2 weeks have you been worried about things or overwhelmed by things, or how many times in the last 2 weeks have you not slept very well? And these are, indicators. So I just don't know. That's just something I'm very curious about because we're not really good at self-reporting things like I am depressed or I'm not depressed. So I'm just really curious how you guys ask the questions.
How big of a challenge is this?
Yeah, and so like
How
if
big
you're
is it?
not willing to say that it's a challenge, or if you're not like the boomer generation is typically not really great at saying there's challenges, especially if there's humility involved. If you're gonna, thinking that anyone will ever read this, are you worried that someone will say you're depressed and then take your job? Like those kind of factors. I'm just really curious how that is involved in the process of actually getting really honest responses from either generation.
was it anonymous?
Yeah, they're anonymous.
So there's
People
at
do
least
pretty well on
anonymous.
anonymous surveys. And all the others, there's been tons of studies that show that anxiety levels and levels of depression are higher for younger generations than they've ever been for any other generation before.
Yeah,
too.
American Height did a lot of work on that as well.
Yeah. And
So
I can just observe this as right in between the Gen X and the baby boomers. It's like depression was not an issue when we were young. That was just something really rare and something about textbooks and somebody that's really messed up. Whereas today it's almost become the cultural norm in a lot of ways for younger generations. Now, you also asked, there were some questions that you asked that better reflect stress. Now, if we were to measure stress, we might not find a generational difference between the two. But the ones that did group together and were correlated were, seemed to have to do with mental health.
Well, parallel question, you made the statement, the rapid change of culture. In my parents' work on stress management and on the mission field, we actually, I spent a lot of time and grew up associated with the mission base in Papua New Guinea, and a pretty significant number of missionaries left the mission field because of stress and because of depression and anxiety disorders, all tied to rapid changes in cultural norms. And I was wondering if part of the reason why the millennials are struggling so much with mental health has more to do with the rapid change in culture that they're facing and the real stressors that affect mental health tied to rapid change, whereas the older generation isn't feeling that because they're not trying to engage in the culture as it's changing. They're just keeping their own culture themselves. And even the study itself, one of the things that jumped out at me is you're reaching out to pastors in a very narrow niche market of churches that tend to be very, very conservative. So they're going to attract people that are looking for conservative context.
Sorry, but we're out of time for this session.
So I just wondered about those things. It feels like the stress is tied to rapid change in culture, maybe.
Yeah, that seems reasonable.
I wonder where is the data come from, how was the sample source? So how many, early church, early pastor and how many young pastor?
It was about 379 and half, about 1/3 were millennial and Gen Zs.
It's time for our next speaker.
Yep.
Thank you very much.